The cold millionaire CEO awoke in her arms. His confession revealed why someone erased the poor girl. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. Ethan Richards, the cold millionaire CEO, never thought his life would change so drastically. On the surface, he had everything: money, power, a thriving empire. But none of that mattered when he woke up in a stranger's arms. He was disoriented, his head pounding, unsure of how he got there. But the warmth of her touch was undeniable. Charlotte Green, the young woman holding him, was no ordinary girl. She wasn't interested in his wealth or his status. In fact, she barely knew who he was. To her, Ethan Richards was just a name she'd heard in passing, a figure of power that seemed distant and untouchable. She was the complete opposite of everything he represented: humble, kind, and struggling to make ends meet. Yet, here they were, caught in a moment neither had anticipated. Ethan's cold demeanor usually kept everyone at arm's length, but Charlotte's presence felt different. Something about her compassion, her genuine care, made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. He could feel the tension in the air, the confusion, the unspoken questions. Charlotte didn't know how to react. She wasn't prepared for this moment, for the man who had suddenly become part of her world in the most unexpected way. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice shaking just a little. Ethan's eyes flickered open, his gaze locking with hers. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. He had never been one to show vulnerability, yet here, in this woman's arms, he felt exposed, something he hadn't experienced in years. "What happened?" he muttered, his voice rough. Charlotte's heart raced. She had no idea what to say. Should she tell him the truth? That the accident that led to his injury was no accident at all? That someone wanted him gone, someone had been willing to erase him from the world? But she couldn't bring herself to share that burden just yet. Instead, she gently helped him sit up. "You were in an accident," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "You've been unconscious for hours." Ethan frowned, trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. He could remember driving late last night, the rain pouring down in sheets, the sound of tires screeching, then nothing. Just darkness. His thoughts were scattered, and he couldn't make sense of it all. But one thing was clear: he was in unfamiliar territory. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Charlotte looked around the small, modest room. "My apartment," she answered, trying to sound calm. "I found you on the side of the road." Ethan tried to stand, but his legs were unsteady. Charlotte quickly reached out to steady him, her hands gentle but firm. "Don't try to get up too fast," she warned him. Ethan didn't like feeling weak, especially not in front of a stranger, but something about Charlotte made him hesitate. There was no arrogance in her touch, no judgment, just a quiet strength that made him feel safe. A feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Ethan's mind raced. How had he ended up here? Who was responsible for what happened? And why was Charlotte, the woman who seemed to have no connection to his world, taking care of him? These questions swirled in his mind, but he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same after today. The room felt too quiet, the silence stretching between them like an invisible thread. Ethan, still trying to shake off the fog in his mind, carefully stood up with Charlotte's help. His legs were shaky, as if his body had forgotten how to carry him. He looked around, taking in the modest furnishings of the apartment. It was small, nothing like the lavish spaces he was used to. There was no expensive art on the walls, no designer furniture, just simple, comfortable pieces that gave off a warm, homey vibe. Charlotte watched him closely, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and caution. She was used to taking care of herself, but this was different. She had never had to care for someone like Ethan before. "You should sit back down," she suggested gently, but Ethan shook his head. "No, I need to understand. What happened? How did I end up here?" His voice was strained, but there was an edge of determination in it. Charlotte hesitated. She hadn't planned to tell him everything just yet. She didn't know how much he remembered, or if he even knew what was really at stake. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her pause. It wasn't the typical arrogance or coldness that she had expected from a man of his stature. There was confusion, vulnerability even. "You were in a car accident," she said slowly, carefully choosing her words. "I found you on the side of the road, unconscious. I brought you here to take care of you." Ethan frowned, trying to piece together the events. He could remember driving, but the rest was a blur. "Who did this to me?" he asked, his tone sharp. Charlotte felt a pang of uncertainty. She didn't want to drag him into the complicated web of lies and deceit that had been woven around him. He wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, she chose to focus on the immediate. "You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time," she said, avoiding his gaze. Ethan didn't buy it. He could tell there was more to the story. His instincts, honed over years of dealing with high-stakes business deals, told him that Charlotte wasn't being entirely honest. But for some reason, he didn't push her. He didn't feel the need to demand the truth right away. Something about her calm presence made him feel safe. It was an odd feeling for someone who had spent most of his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. "You didn't have to help me," Ethan said quietly, his voice softening for the first time. "Why did you?" Charlotte glanced down at the floor, unsure how to answer. She wasn't used to being asked about her motives. She had never been a person who expected anything in return. But with Ethan, it was different. "I couldn't just leave you there," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't right. Ethan studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to understand. The woman standing before him was not like anyone he had ever met. She wasn't looking at him as a source of power or wealth, nor did she seem interested in what he could offer. She simply wanted to help. It was disarming. "You don't even know who I am," he said, almost as a statement, but it hung in the air, a challenge. Charlotte met his gaze without hesitation. "I know enough," she said softly. "I know that everyone deserves a chance. Even you." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He wasn't used to people seeing him for more than just a billionaire businessman. Most of the time, people saw the cold exterior, the unapproachable CEO, but Charlotte saw something different. For a moment, he forgot about the pain in his head, the confusion swirling inside him. He forgot about the questions he had been meaning to ask. Instead, he just looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. And in that moment, something shifted. Charlotte felt the weight of his gaze on her, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. She wasn't sure what it was, but something about Ethan Richards made her heart race. Maybe it was the vulnerability she saw in him, or maybe it was just the sheer weight of the situation. Whatever it was, she felt an undeniable connection, a pull that she couldn't explain. Ethan took a slow breath, his mind racing. He had been trained to keep his emotions in check, to never let his guard down. But with Charlotte, it felt different. She wasn't like the people he usually interacted with. She wasn't after anything. And that, for some reason, made him feel both unsettled and strangely comforted. "I don't know what's going on," Ethan said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "But I need to figure it out. I need to know who's behind this." Charlotte didn't respond immediately. She could tell that Ethan wasn't going to let this go. But she also knew that the truth wasn't something he was ready to hear. Not yet. Not while he was still recovering. "You'll get your answers," she said quietly. "But not right now. You need to rest." Ethan didn't argue. He wasn't in any position to fight her. Instead, he nodded slowly, his mind still working through the jumbled mess of thoughts. As he sat back down, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. As the days passed, Ethan's recovery moved. Slowly, the dizziness that had clouded his thoughts gradually faded, but the questions in his mind only grew louder. Charlotte, meanwhile, seemed to carry on with her life, the same quiet, unassuming woman who had first helped him, yet something had shifted in the way she looked at him. Every time their eyes met, Ethan noticed a subtle hesitation, as if she were holding back something. He couldn't help but wonder what it was. She never pushed him to talk, never demanded answers, but it was clear she was hiding something. Ethan wasn't used to being the one who had to wait for answers. In his world, he was the one who controlled the narrative, who pulled the strings. But here, in this small, cozy apartment with no luxurious distractions, he felt helpless, like a pawn in someone else's game. One afternoon, as Charlotte busied herself with her work in the small living room, Ethan decided it was time to confront her. He had had enough of the silence, enough of the uncertainty. He needed to know who was responsible for the accident. The person who had orchestrated it. The one who had tried to erase him from the picture. With a deep breath, he stood up and walked towards the kitchen, where Charlotte was sorting through some papers. "Charlotte," he said, his voice more serious than he intended. She looked up at him, her expression guarded but calm. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Charlotte's eyes flickered, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. The air between them grew thick with the weight of unspoken words. "What do you mean?" she finally asked, her tone deliberately neutral. Ethan took a step closer. "You know more than you're letting on. About what happened to me. About why I'm here." Charlotte sighed softly, her shoulders slumping just slightly. She didn't want to get into this, not yet. She had hoped that Ethan would focus on his recovery first, that he wouldn't press her so soon. But now, standing in front of her, there was no mistaking the intensity in his eyes. "I don't know what you think you know," she said slowly, avoiding his gaze. "But I don't have all the answers. I'm just trying to help." Ethan's gaze softened a little, but his resolve remained. "I don't need help. I need the truth." Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. She knew the truth, but it wasn't hers to tell. Not yet. She wanted to protect him, to keep him from the web of lies that had been spun around him. But at the same time, she knew he deserved to know. She couldn't keep him in the dark forever. "There's a lot you don't know," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things that are complicated. Things you're not ready for." Ethan reached out and gently took her hand, his grip firm but not forceful. "I can handle it," he said quietly. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't deny the pull she felt towards him, the strange connection that had formed between them in such a short time. "It's not about what you can handle," she said, her voice shaky. "It's about what you're willing to hear." Ethan squeezed her hand slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm willing to hear anything. But I need to know who did this to me. Who wanted to erase me." Charlotte bit her lip, her mind racing. She could see the determination in his eyes, the same relentless drive that had made him successful in everything he did. It was the same drive that had caused the accident in the first place. "There are people," she started slowly, "who don't want you in the picture. People who want you gone." Ethan's pulse quickened at her words, but he stayed calm, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what she was saying. "Who?" he asked, his voice low but intense. Charlotte shook her head, her eyes filled with hesitation. "I can't tell you yet," she replied. "Not until you're ready." Ethan exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his chest. "I'm ready now. Tell me." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Your family. Someone close to you. They're the ones behind this." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His family? The people he had trusted most in the world? The thought was impossible to wrap his mind around. But as he stared at Charlotte, he could see the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't lying. This was real. Ethan took a step back, his mind spinning. His thoughts were a chaotic blur as he tried to process everything Charlotte had just revealed. "Why would they do this?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Charlotte didn't have an answer. She wished she did, but the truth was far too complicated to explain in a single conversation. Instead, she just looked at him, silently offering her support, her presence. Ethan's chest tightened as he struggled to make sense of what he had just heard. His family, the ones who had always been by his side, were the ones behind this. It didn't make sense. He felt betrayed, but at the same time, something deep within him told him this was just the beginning. And no matter what, he was going to get to the bottom of it. He had to. The question was, who else would be dragged into the web of lies before the truth finally came to light? The weight of Charlotte's words hung in the air, thick with the tension of what they had just revealed. Ethan stood there, his mind still trying to catch up with the revelation. His own family, the ones he had trusted more than anyone in the world, were involved in trying to erase him. The very people who had shaped his life, who had been there through every success and failure, were now his enemies. The thought seemed impossible to process. Charlotte, noticing the look of confusion and disbelief on his face, felt a pang of sympathy. She had known this truth for days now, but to hear Ethan's reaction, to see the hurt in his eyes, made her wish she could take it all back. But she couldn't. This was reality, and Ethan had to face it, whether he was ready or not. She took a deep breath, her mind working to find the right words to say. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. But it's the truth. Your family is involved in this, whether you want to believe it or not. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He had always been taught to trust his family above all else, but now everything felt like a lie. Why would they do this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte shook her head, unsure how to answer. I don't have all the answers, Ethan. I wish I did. But I know they've been behind a lot of things that have happened to you. They don't want you to succeed. They want you out of the picture. Ethan's mind raced. The more he thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. The strange things that had happened in his life, the obstacles that had seemed to appear out of nowhere, the sabotage in his business dealings, it was all starting to align. But it still didn't make sense. Why would his family, of all people, want him gone? I don't understand, he muttered, pacing the room. Why would they want to destroy me? I've done everything they asked. I've been the perfect son, the perfect businessman. I've followed their rules my whole life. Charlotte watched him closely, her heart aching for him. Sometimes, Ethan, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, people do things because they want power. Control. Your family has always been in control of everything. And you were always a threat to that. Maybe they thought that if they got rid of you, they could have everything for themselves. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his mind reeling with the implications. The people he had trusted the most, the ones who had taught him everything he knew about success, had seen him as a threat? The idea was almost too much to bear. I can't believe this, he said, his voice thick with disbelief. I thought I knew them. I thought they were on my side. They never were, Charlotte said softly. Not the way you thought. And that's why you're in danger. They've already tried to eliminate you once, and they'll keep coming for you until they get what they want. The weight of her words settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He felt a surge of anger, frustration, and confusion all at once. But more than anything, he felt a deep sense of betrayal. His family, the ones who were supposed to have his back, had been plotting against him all along. What do I do now? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Charlotte looked at him, her expression softening. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between wanting to hold on to the family he had always known and the harsh reality that was now in front of him. You fight back, she said simply. You don't let them win. You find the truth. And you expose them for what they've done. You don't let them take away your life. Ethan felt a flicker of hope in her words. For the first time in days, he felt like he had a direction, a purpose. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there were more challenges ahead, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. I'm not going to let them win, he said, his voice steady and determined. I'll find out who's behind this, and I'll make them pay. Charlotte nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossing her face. That's the Ethan Richards I know, she said softly. As Ethan stood there, his resolve firming with each passing second, he knew this was just the beginning. He had a long road ahead of him, one filled with danger, betrayal, and uncertainty. But with Charlotte by his side, he wasn't alone. And that thought, even amidst the chaos, gave him the strength to keep moving forward. The next few days felt like a whirlwind to Ethan. The weight of the truth about his family was heavy on his shoulders, and the constant buzz of unanswered questions rattled in his mind. Charlotte had been his constant, his only source of stability. Despite the emotional roller coaster he was riding, she had remained calm and steady, always there when he needed her. But Ethan knew he couldn't just sit idly by. He had to act. His entire life had been based on the foundation of trust. Trust in his family, trust in the people around him. But now that foundation was crumbling. He couldn't ignore the fact that someone close to him had orchestrated the accident. His world was now filled with suspicion. The more Ethan thought about his family's involvement, the more he began to realize that there were far-reaching implications. They hadn't just wanted to ruin him. They had wanted to control everything. But he wouldn't let them. He couldn't. We need to find more information, Ethan said one evening, as he sat across from Charlotte at the small kitchen table. His voice was low, filled with resolve. Charlotte looked up from her papers, her eyes soft but filled with concern. Ethan, are you sure? It's dangerous. The deeper we go, the more we risk. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. I'm not afraid of danger. I've spent my whole life fighting for control, and I won't let them take it from me now. We need to know who's pulling the strings. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but we do this carefully. We take it one step at a time. Ethan wasn't sure if Charlotte was worried about him or about herself. But either way, he understood her hesitation. What they were about to do wasn't just dangerous, it was risky. But as much as he hated to admit it, he needed Charlotte. Her steady presence, her intelligence, and her calm demeanor had been the only things keeping him grounded through all of this. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "My father, my uncle, they're both involved in the business. But they've always been more secretive than I realized. What if they've been hiding things from me all along? What if they were never on my side?" Charlotte's gaze softened as she reached out, placing a reassuring hand over his. "Ethan, it's not easy to accept, but sometimes the people we trust the most can let us down. We have to trust ourselves now." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. His family, the people who had been by his side since the beginning, had betrayed him. They had treated him like a pawn in their game of power. But he wouldn't let that happen. "We'll find the answers," he said, more to himself than to Charlotte. "And when we do, I'll make sure they pay for what they've done." Charlotte's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was no fear in her gaze. Only the quiet strength that had become his anchor. "We'll do this together," she said softly. That was all Ethan needed to hear. He wasn't alone. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan and Charlotte began their quiet investigation. They went through old records, financial documents, and private files, looking for any clue that would lead them to the truth. Each day brought new revelations, new pieces of the puzzle, but they still hadn't found enough to confront his family directly. The more they dug, the more Ethan began to realize that this was bigger than just his family's betrayal. Someone had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, someone with far more power than he had ever imagined. He had always been a man of influence, but now he understood just how small he was in the grand scheme of things. And it terrified him. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit apartment, Charlotte leaned back in her chair and let out a sigh. "We're getting close, I can feel it," she said, glancing at the papers scattered across the table. Ethan didn't reply immediately. His mind was racing. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know. "What if they come for us?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan met her gaze, a steady calm settling over him. "Then we fight back." The silence between them was filled with an unspoken understanding. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened, they were in this together. And Ethan Richards, the man who had once been surrounded by nothing but power and control, was now fighting for something far more important. The truth. And he would stop at nothing to uncover it. The days stretched on, and with each passing moment, the pressure only grew. Ethan and Charlotte had been digging deeper into the secrets that surrounded his family, but every step they took seemed to bring more questions than answers. The documents they had uncovered painted a picture of manipulation and deceit, but the true mastermind remained elusive. As they sat together one evening, scanning through yet another pile of financial records, Ethan's frustration was palpable. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his finger tracing the numbers on the page. "Everything points to them, but there's no smoking gun." Charlotte, sitting across from him, sighed softly. She could see how much this was wearing on him. The once cold and distant billionaire was now a man consumed with determination, but also weighed down by the betrayal of the people he had trusted most. "Maybe we're not looking in the right place," she suggested, her voice calm but filled with concern. "We've been so focused on the money, but what if it's not about that?" Ethan paused, lifting his eyes from the papers. "What do you mean?" Charlotte leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. "I mean, maybe the money was just a means to an end. Maybe there's something bigger at play here." Ethan frowned, his mind racing. What could be bigger than control of the company? The money, the power, it's all tied together. Charlotte shook her head. "It's not just about that. Look at how things have escalated. The accident, the manipulation. Someone wanted you out of the way, but it wasn't just for the company or the wealth. There's something else they're after." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as Charlotte's words sank in. What could they want that was more important than everything he had built? And why was he the target? As the puzzle pieces began to shift in his mind, Ethan realized something that made his blood run cold. The people who had always controlled his life, the ones who had shaped his world from behind the scenes, had seen him as a threat from the beginning. But why now? Why had they gone to such lengths to take him down? "You're right," he said quietly, the weight of realization settling over him. It's not about the company. It's about me. Charlotte looked at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. What do you mean? Ethan stood up, his hands clenched at his sides as he began to pace the small apartment. They've been using me all these years, controlling me, manipulating me, but I was never the one they wanted to have the power. I was always just a pawn in their game. He stopped, his gaze fixed on her. But now, they're scared. They've realized I'm not just a pawn anymore. I'm a player, and they can't control me anymore. Charlotte watched him carefully, her eyes studying his every movement. So what do we do now? She asked softly. Ethan stopped pacing, his expression hardening with resolve. We find out who's been pulling the strings. And when we do, we take them down. Charlotte nodded slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had seen this side of Ethan before, the side that was ruthless and determined, the side that never backed down. But this time, she wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. And what happens when we find them? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his gaze intense. We make them pay. For everything. We expose them for who they are, and we make sure they can never hurt anyone again. Charlotte felt a chill at his words, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. Ethan wasn't just angry, he was determined, and nothing was going to stand in his way now. Okay, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. Then we do this together. We find them. We expose them. Ethan's eyes softened for a moment, his expression shifting as he looked at her. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. I couldn't do this without you. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt a sense of purpose. She had come into Ethan's life by accident, but now she realized just how much she had become a part of his journey. Together, they were going to take down the people who had betrayed him. They were going to uncover the truth, and they were going to make sure no one could hurt him again. The path ahead was uncertain, and the dangers they faced were real. But with each passing day, Ethan and Charlotte grew closer to the truth. And with that truth came the promise of justice. No matter what it took, they were going to see it through to the end. The search for answers had become an obsession for Ethan. Every day, Charlotte and he sifted through more documents, more hidden files, and long-forgotten emails, trying to piece together the full picture. They had uncovered much, but the deeper they dug, the more complicated things became. There were layers of secrecy, lies buried so deep that even Ethan's own family seemed to be pawns in someone else's game. The more he learned, the more he realized that he had been living in a carefully constructed illusion. Nothing was what it seemed. His family's wealth, the business he had inherited, even his place in the world, it was all part of a larger scheme, one that had been orchestrated long before he'd come into power. One evening, as they sat together in the small apartment, Ethan stared at the pile of papers in front of him, frustration mounting. He had always been able to make quick decisions, to solve problems with precision and ease. But this was different. It was personal. It was his life, and it had been turned upside down. I just don't understand, Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. All of this, it points to my family, but there's something more. Someone else is behind it. Charlotte watched him closely, her eyes filled with understanding. She had seen him at his strongest, at his most determined. But this was a man who was struggling to make sense of a world that had been turned against him. You're not wrong, Charlotte said quietly. I've been thinking the same thing. There's someone pulling the strings, someone powerful, someone who doesn't want you in the picture. Ethan looked up, his eyes narrowing. Who? He asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Charlotte paused, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table as she thought. It's not clear yet, but I have a feeling we're getting closer. Whoever it is, they've been operating in the shadows, hiding their tracks. But we can't stop now. Ethan leaned back, his mind racing. What if they're closer than we think? He asked. Charlotte's expression softened as she met his gaze. Then we have to be ready. We have to be smarter, more strategic. We don't know who we're up against, but we know they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. And what is it they want? Ethan's voice was low, barely above a whisper. Charlotte didn't respond right away. She had her own theories, but she wasn't ready to voice them. Not yet. Instead, she simply placed a hand on Ethan's. We'll find out, she said softly. We'll find them. And we'll stop them before it's too late. The promise in her words was comforting, yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it seemed to become. Every clue led to a dead end. Every trail seemed to vanish just when they thought they were close to the truth. But one thing had become crystal clear: someone was watching them. The feeling had been there for days now, a subtle sense of being followed, of being observed. Ethan couldn't tell if it was just paranoia or something more, but the unease in his gut told him it was real. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice sharp. "There's someone watching us. I don't know who, but we're not as invisible as we think." Charlotte nodded, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for any sign of danger. She had felt it too. The constant weight of suspicion in the air, the feeling that they were not alone in their search. "What do you want to do?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. Ethan stood up, his mind now working with a newfound sense of urgency. "We keep going," he said, his voice firm. "We don't back down. But we'll have to be smarter about it. We have to cover our tracks, make sure no one knows what we're up to. We keep moving forward, but we do it quietly." Charlotte stood up as well, her resolve matching his. "All right," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll be careful, but we'll find them. And when we do, we'll make them pay." Ethan's heart beat faster at the conviction in her voice. There was no turning back now. They were in this together, and no matter how deep the danger went, no matter how much they had to sacrifice, Ethan was determined to finish what he had started. The truth was within reach, and nothing was going to stop him from finding it. With Charlotte by his side, he felt like they could take on anything. They were a team, and together, they would uncover the secret that had been hidden for so long. And when they did, they would expose the people who had been behind the curtain all along. Ethan knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. But it would be the beginning of his revenge. And nothing was going to stand in his way. The tension was building, and every day that passed without answers seemed to stretch on forever. Ethan and Charlotte had uncovered enough to know that someone close to him was involved in the plot against him. Yet, they still hadn't discovered who the real mastermind was. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they were scattered, and they had no idea how they fit together. It was like playing a game with rules that kept changing. "We can't keep going like this," Ethan muttered one evening, frustration evident in his voice as he scanned yet another document that led to nowhere. "We need a break. We need to think differently." Charlotte, who had been quietly organizing their notes, looked up at him. Her expression was a mix of exhaustion and determination. "What if the answer has been in front of us this whole time?" she asked softly. Ethan's eyes flickered toward her, intrigued by her words. "What do you mean?" Charlotte took a deep breath and slowly stood up, walking over to the stack of papers they had been sorting through. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a financial record from one of Ethan's family's business ventures. "The dates here don't add up. It's like someone was trying to cover their tracks by manipulating the numbers. But if we follow the money back far enough, we might be able to find the connection." Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. This was the first new lead they had gotten in days. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with hope. "I think we need to look at the people who have always been around your family," Charlotte said. "The ones you trust the most. If they've been hiding things from you, they might be the key to finding out who's really behind everything." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. It was one thing to suspect his family had been involved, but to think that the people closest to him might be the ones pulling the strings was another thing entirely. "You think someone I trust is behind this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte nodded, her face hardening with the same determination that had kept her by his side through this whole ordeal. "It's not easy to accept, but sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the most. And if we want to find out who's really behind this, we need to start by looking at those people." Ethan let out a long, slow breath as he processed her words. He had spent years trusting the people around him, believing that his family had his best interests at heart. But now, that trust seemed shattered. Could the people who had shaped his life really be the ones responsible for trying to tear it all apart? "I don't know if I'm ready to confront them," Ethan admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Charlotte's eyes softened. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure this out together." The words seemed to ground him, reminding him that he wasn't fighting this battle by himself. They had come this far, and no matter how difficult it got, he knew he couldn't back down now. "Okay," he said finally, his voice resolute. "Let's look at everyone. Let's start with the people who have always been closest to me." Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, poring over old files, cross-referencing names, and analyzing every bit of information they had gathered. Slowly but surely, a clearer picture began to emerge. There were subtle connections, small hints in the margins of documents, things that shouldn't have been there if everything was on the up and up. As the evidence piled up, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were uncovering. The people who had been closest to him were involved in a scheme far bigger than he had ever imagined. But even as the truth began to come into focus, there was a growing sense of dread. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let them find out without a fight. "We're getting close," Charlotte said one evening, her voice tinged with both excitement and caution. "But we need to be careful. Whoever did this will be watching." Ethan nodded, the reality of the situation settling heavily on him. He had thought his wealth and power would protect him, but now he knew that it was his enemies who were in control of the game. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the feeling that they were closing in on him. "I know," he replied, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "But I'm not going to stop now. I won't let them win." Charlotte's eyes met his, and for the first time in days, she saw a flicker of hope in his expression. They had come so far, and they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The end was in sight, but the danger was real. With each step forward, they were putting themselves more at risk. But Ethan couldn't turn back now. He had to see it through. With Charlotte by his side, he knew that together, they would get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. The truth was within reach, but the closer Ethan and Charlotte got, the more the dangers seemed to escalate. Each step forward brought a fresh wave of fear, not just for Ethan's future, but for both of their safety. The pieces were coming together, but they had yet to connect them all. Ethan stared at the documents on the table in front of him, the names and dates swimming before his eyes as he tried to make sense of it all. The people he had trusted his entire life, the ones who had shaped his business and his future, were the very ones who had conspired against him. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it cut deeper than anything he had ever felt before. "We're getting close. I can feel it," Charlotte said, her voice barely a whisper as she leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the final document they needed to understand. Ethan didn't reply at first. His thoughts were too tangled, too full of questions. He wasn't sure how much more of this he could take. The thought of confronting his family, of knowing that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was founded on lies, was more than overwhelming. "What if they try to stop us?" he asked quietly, looking up at Charlotte. She met his gaze, her expression firm but compassionate. "They might. But we've already come this far, and we can't stop now. We have the truth, Ethan. We just need to expose it." The calm resolve in her voice gave him the strength he didn't realize he needed. For the first time since this all began, he felt the weight of the truth lift off his chest. There was a clarity now. He wasn't alone in this fight. They had come too far to turn back. "You're right," he said, his voice steady with determination. "We do have the truth, and I won't let them silence us." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat at his words. She could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had made him successful in business, the same fire that would make him fight for what was right. She had seen it before, but now, it was different. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal, and she wasn't just standing by as a bystander. "We're going to expose them," Charlotte said firmly, the weight of her words settling in. She wasn't sure what would come next, or what the consequences would be, but she knew that she couldn't back down. Neither could Ethan. They had reached the point of no return. As they continued to sift through the final pieces of evidence, they began to see something even more disturbing. It wasn't just about a power struggle within Ethan's family or the manipulation of business dealings. It was far more insidious. The conspiracy reached into areas they hadn't expected, involving people they hadn't even considered. The stakes were higher than they had ever realized, and the truth was even darker than they had anticipated. "There's someone else," Charlotte murmured as she looked up from the documents. "Someone outside of the family. Someone with even more power than them." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the implications of her words sank in. He had always thought that his family's greed and control were the driving forces behind the conspiracy, but now, it seemed like there was an even bigger player in the game. Someone who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. "Who?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with a mix of fear and anger. Charlotte shook her head. "I don't know yet, but I think they've been using your family as pawns. They've been manipulating the whole situation from behind the scenes. We need to find out who this person is before they find us. The gravity of the situation hit Ethan like a wave. Whoever this person was, they had to be stopped. They were the key to the entire plot, and if they weren't taken down, Ethan knew that the conspiracy would never truly end. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. We need to be smart about this, Ethan said, his voice low but filled with resolve. We can't confront them directly, not yet. But we need to find out who they are, and we need to do it quickly. Charlotte nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. I'll start looking into their financial ties. They have to be connected somehow. If we can follow the money, we can find them. Ethan stood up, his eyes scanning the room. He was no longer the man who had been blindsided by his family's betrayal. He was the man ready to take control of his own fate. Let's do it, he said firmly. We find them. We expose them. And we put an end to this once and for all. As they worked late into the night, both of them knew that the path ahead was uncertain. The person pulling the strings was still out there, hidden in the shadows, but they were getting closer. Every piece of the puzzle was leading them to a dark truth, one that could change everything. But one thing was clear, they weren't going to stop until they had uncovered it all. The fight wasn't over yet, but Ethan and Charlotte were prepared to do whatever it took to finish what they had started. The tension was almost unbearable as Ethan and Charlotte closed in on the truth. Each new discovery only seemed to reveal more complexity to the conspiracy they were up against. The shadowy figure they had been trying to identify remained elusive, but every clue they uncovered pointed to someone with more power and resources than they could have imagined. As they sifted through the last of the financial documents, Charlotte looked up from the papers, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. I think we're finally getting somewhere, she said, her voice steady but filled with concern. Ethan looked up from his work, his eyes hard with resolve. How sure are you? He asked, his tone cautious. Charlotte adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, her fingers tracing the names on a long list of offshore accounts. I'm sure, she said softly. The connections are starting to make sense. Whoever is behind this has been working in the background for years, pulling the strings and making sure no one could trace anything back to them. Ethan's heart raced as he processed her words. It was exactly what they had feared. Someone with deep pockets and even deeper secrets had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. The idea that someone had been using his family as pawns in their game of power was a bitter pill to swallow. We need to confront them, Ethan said, his voice filled with a cold fury. Now. Charlotte shook her head. Not yet. We're not ready. We don't even know who they are yet, Ethan. Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't care who they are. I've had enough of hiding, enough of being controlled. We know it's one of them. My family has been behind this the whole time, and I'm done playing their game. Charlotte stood as well, her calm presence an anchor in the storm of Ethan's emotions. I understand how you feel, she said quietly. But rushing in without all the pieces could make everything worse. If we don't have the full picture, we'll walk right into their trap. Ethan clenched his fists, struggling to contain the anger and frustration that were threatening to spill over. Then what do we do? He asked through gritted teeth. Charlotte took a step closer, her voice calm but firm. We take the time we need to get the answers. We follow the money, follow the names, until we can get to the heart of this. If we confront them now, we might be playing into their hands. Ethan exhaled sharply, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He knew Charlotte was right. If they acted too quickly, they could risk everything. But the thought of doing nothing, of waiting any longer, felt unbearable. How much longer do you think it will take? He asked, his voice tinged with impatience. Charlotte paused, considering the question carefully. We're close, but I need to dig a little deeper into these offshore accounts. I need to make sure there's no trail we're missing. Ethan nodded, his mind already turning the situation over. He had never been one to sit idle, but Charlotte's point was clear. Rushing in without all the facts would be a mistake. All right, he said finally. We wait. But I want answers, Charlotte. I want to know who did this to me and why. Charlotte gave him a reassuring look. We will. I promise you, we're getting closer. The next few days were a blur of late nights and long hours of research. Charlotte worked tirelessly, digging deeper into the financial records and tracing connections that led them further down the rabbit hole. Ethan did his best to stay focused, but the weight of the uncertainty was beginning to take its toll. Every time the phone rang or someone knocked at the door, his heart skipped a beat, wondering if the person behind all this was finally coming for him. But as the hours passed, the pieces started to fit together. They were getting closer to the truth, closer to exposing the person who had masterminded it all. Then, one evening, Charlotte finally looked up from her laptop, a look of triumph on her face. "I've got it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet excitement. Ethan stood up, his pulse quickening. "What did you find?" Charlotte turned the laptop around to face him, revealing a name that made Ethan's blood run cold. The name was familiar, too. Familiar. It was a name he had trusted, a name that had always been there in the background, operating quietly behind the scenes. It was someone close, someone he never would have suspected. "It's them," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been behind everything all along." Ethan's hands clenched into fists as he stared at the screen. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The person who had been pulling the strings, the person who had been orchestrating the entire conspiracy, was someone he had trusted with his life. It was a betrayal of the highest order. "I should have known," Ethan muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "They've been manipulating me from the start." Charlotte placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "We'll expose them," she said. "This is it, Ethan. This is the moment we've been waiting for." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with both anger and resolve. "We're going to make sure they pay for this," he said, his voice cold with determination. "No one betrays me and gets away with it." Charlotte nodded, her face set with the same determination. "We do this carefully, but we will make sure the truth comes out." Ethan took a deep breath, his mind already racing with the next steps. They had the name, they had the evidence, and now they had to make sure the truth reached the right people. The battle wasn't over yet, it was only just beginning. The discovery hit Ethan like a thunderclap. The name on the screen was someone he never would have suspected. It was a name that had been in the background of his life for years, always just out of focus, never a central figure, but always there, quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. Someone who had been so close, so trusted, that the betrayal felt almost impossible to process. "I can't believe this," Ethan muttered, staring at the name, his thoughts racing. "How could they do this to me?" Charlotte remained quiet for a moment, allowing the weight of the revelation to sink in. She knew how hard this must be for Ethan, but they didn't have time to dwell on the betrayal. They had to act quickly before the person behind it all had a chance to cover their tracks. "We can't waste any more time," Charlotte said softly, her voice steady and resolute. "We have to expose them before they can stop us." Ethan looked up at her, his face hardening with resolve. "You're right. We've come this far. We're not backing down now." He stood up, pacing around the small apartment, his mind spinning. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. All this time, he had been working under the assumption that his family had been the ones plotting against him, but the truth was far more twisted. The person who had been controlling everything was someone he had trusted more than anyone. Someone who had been a constant presence in his life. Someone who had never given him any reason to doubt their loyalty. "We have to be careful," Charlotte warned, watching him closely. "This person has a lot of power, and they've been manipulating things for a long time. If we're not careful, they'll find a way to cover their tracks or shut us down." Ethan paused, looking at her with a sharp gaze. "I know, but we can't let them win. They've taken everything from me. Now it's my turn." The fire in his voice was unmistakable. Charlotte could see the depth of his pain, the rage that was bubbling just below the surface. She knew that this wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about revenge. "We'll do it your way," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the danger that loomed over them. "But we have to be smart about it. We need to gather all the evidence, make sure we have everything we need to take them down before we confront them." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "We'll do it carefully, but once we have everything, we go public. No more secrets. No more hiding." The next few days were a blur of activity as Ethan and Charlotte worked tirelessly, putting together the final pieces of the puzzle. They gathered documents, photos, and recordings, anything they could find that would tie the mastermind to the conspiracy. With every piece they uncovered, the picture grew clearer. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. They knew they were getting closer to the truth, but they also knew that the person behind it all was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We're almost there," Charlotte said one evening, her voice tight with a mixture of excitement, and fear. We've got everything we need. We just need to find a way to make it all public. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he thought about their next move. We take it straight to the media. No one can deny the truth when it's out there for everyone to see. Charlotte hesitated. But exposing them like that could make them retaliate. We need to be prepared for what's coming. Ethan turned to her, his face set with determination. I'm prepared. I've spent my whole life being controlled, but not anymore. This ends now. The tension between them was palpable as they worked late into the night, finalizing their plans. Ethan knew that once they went public, there would be no turning back. The person who had been manipulating him and his family would stop at nothing to protect themselves. But Ethan didn't care. He had nothing left to lose. As the first rays of dawn broke through the window, Ethan and Charlotte finalized their plan. They would go to the press, and they would expose the truth, no matter what the cost. We're ready, Charlotte said, her voice calm but filled with resolve. Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of finality settle over him. Let's do this. The next day, they made their move. With everything in place, they took the documents and the evidence to a trusted journalist, someone they knew would take the story seriously. It was a risk, but it was the only way to ensure that the truth came to light. Ethan's heart pounded as they handed over the information, but there was no turning back. They had done everything they could to make sure that when the story broke, it would be undeniable. The media frenzy was immediate. Within hours, the story was all over the news. The name Ethan had found on the documents, the name of the person who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, was now out in the open. The public was in shock. The betrayal was massive, the scale of the manipulation staggering. As the truth came to light, Ethan felt a strange mixture of relief and vindication. He had taken back control. He had exposed the people who had tried to destroy him. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The person behind it all wouldn't go down without a fight. And Ethan wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The storm of media attention was exactly what Ethan had expected, but the fallout was more intense than he could have imagined. The story had broken wide open, and the world was watching. The name that had once been a symbol of trust and loyalty was now synonymous with betrayal and deceit. Ethan's mind raced as he watched the news coverage unfold, his hands gripping the edge of the table. This is just the beginning, he muttered to himself, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The public's reaction was fierce. People were in shock, unable to comprehend the depths of the conspiracy that had been hidden for so long. But while the truth was out, the battle was far from over. Ethan knew that exposing the mastermind behind everything wasn't going to be enough. The person responsible, the one who had manipulated him and his family, wasn't going to go down without a fight. The more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized just how dangerous this situation had become. He wasn't just up against a few corrupt business people anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. There were powerful figures involved, figures who had a lot to lose if the full extent of their actions came to light. Ethan turned to Charlotte, who had been quiet as she watched the news coverage, her face unreadable. What happens next? He asked, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. Charlotte took a deep breath, her eyes focused on the screen. Now we wait, she said, her voice calm but firm. The storm is just starting. They're going to retaliate. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. They had taken a huge step forward by exposing the truth, but now they were in the crosshairs of some very powerful people. We've done what we can, Ethan said, though his mind was far from at ease. But I won't rest until I know the full truth. I won't stop until the person behind this is held accountable. Charlotte's gaze softened as she turned to him. And we'll find them, she said. But we need to be strategic. We need to keep gathering information, make sure we have every piece of the puzzle before we go after them. Ethan stood up, his mind spinning with plans and contingencies. He had always been a man of action, and now more than ever, he needed to focus on the next steps. We go after their finances, he said, a determined fire in his eyes. We trace every dollar, every transaction. If we can find the money trail, we can bring them down. Charlotte nodded, clearly on the same page. I'll start digging through their offshore accounts. We might find a few more connections that will give us the leverage we need. As they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a feeling that had been lingering for days, ever since the story had gone public. The weight of knowing that someone powerful was keeping an eye on them made the atmosphere in the apartment feel suffocating. Ethan turned to Charlotte, his face hard with resolve. We need to stay one step ahead. Whoever is behind this is not going to stop. They'll do whatever it takes to keep the truth from coming out. Charlotte's expression was one of quiet determination. And we won't stop either, she said. We'll make sure the truth comes to light, no matter the cost. They worked late into the night, poring over financial records, piecing together the hidden connections that could take them to the heart of the conspiracy. Each discovery seemed to bring them closer, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Ethan knew that there was no turning back now. They had exposed the truth to the world, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. But he wasn't afraid. He had nothing left to lose. With Charlotte by his side, he felt an unshakable resolve. The fight was far from over, but now, at least, they were in the position to take the fight to those who had wronged him. The next few days passed in a blur of research and planning, as they continued to follow the money trail. The web of corruption was deeper than they had ever imagined, and the people involved were more powerful than Ethan had ever realized. But with each new lead, they grew more confident that they were on the right path. Finally, after days of relentless investigation, they found the breakthrough they had been looking for. A series of encrypted transactions pointed to an offshore account that seemed to be at the center of it all. The name associated with the account was familiar, but it wasn't one that Ethan had expected. It was a name from his past, someone who had been involved in his business dealings years ago, someone who had been quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. As the truth began to unfold, Ethan's heart raced. This person, someone he had once trusted, was the key to everything. The final piece of the puzzle was within reach, and Ethan knew that they had to act fast. "This is it," he said, his voice low and filled with anticipation. "We've got them." Charlotte's eyes narrowed as she studied the information. "We need to move quickly. This person won't go down without a fight." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "We take them down. For good." With everything in place, they were ready to make their next move. The clock was ticking, and Ethan knew that the moment of truth was fast approaching. The final confrontation was inevitable, but Ethan was prepared. He had nothing left to lose, and he was ready to make sure that the people who had betrayed him would pay the price. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight was about to reach its climax. The final confrontation had arrived, and the weight of everything Ethan had worked for hung in the balance. The evidence was in their hands, and the mastermind behind the conspiracy was finally within reach. Ethan could feel the intensity of the moment, the pressure of everything that had led them here building with every passing second. Charlotte had been by his side every step of the way, and now, more than ever, he knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake. They had spent days preparing, gathering every shred of evidence, every document, every clue that could expose the person who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. The mastermind, someone Ethan had once trusted, had been manipulating him and his family for years, but now it was time for the truth to be revealed. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, taking one last look at himself before the next step. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had lost everything, but who was determined to take back control. He had nothing left to lose, and in that, he found his strength. Charlotte stood behind him, her voice calm but resolute. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her words steady and unshaken. Ethan turned to face her, his eyes steely with determination. "I'm ready. We've come too far to turn back now. It ends today." The plan was simple. Deliver the final blow by presenting the evidence to the right people. Expose the mastermind for who they really were. Ethan knew that once the truth was out there, there would be no going back. But the weight of knowing it was almost over, of finally taking control of his life again, pushed him forward. They had the media, they had the documents, and they had the support they needed to bring this person to justice. The mastermind had tried to erase Ethan, but now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. As they made their way to the location, Ethan felt the tension in the air. The closer they got, the more he could sense the looming danger. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Whoever they were up against had power, and with power came resources. But Ethan had a new kind of strength now. He wasn't the same man who had been manipulated into silence. He wasn't the same man who had been paralyzed by his family's control. No, Now he was a man on a mission. They arrived at the press conference, the room buzzing with reporters eager to hear the latest story. The stakes had never been higher, and Ethan knew that the moment he stepped into that room, his life would change forever. But that didn't matter anymore. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. As the room quieted and all eyes turned to him, Ethan stepped up to the podium, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The magnitude of what he was about to do hit him all at once. But there was no turning back. He had a purpose now, and that purpose was bigger than fear. He was no longer the pawn in someone else's game. He was the one in control. "Thank you all for coming," Ethan began, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Today I stand before you to tell the truth. For too long, my life has been controlled by people who never had my best interests at heart. The people I trusted, the people I thought had my back, turns out they were the ones pulling the strings." The room was silent as Ethan paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. He could feel the eyes of the reporters on him, their pens poised, their cameras ready. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the fallout, but he knew that it was time. "The person behind all of this," he continued, his voice cutting through the silence, "is someone I never would have suspected. Someone who I thought was a friend, someone I trusted with my life." He paused again, allowing the tension to build. Charlotte stood off to the side, her eyes locked on Ethan, her unwavering support giving him the strength to carry on. "The mastermind behind this entire conspiracy is none other than—" Ethan's voice faltered for just a moment as he revealed the name. The name that had been hidden in the shadows for so long. The name that would now change everything. As the words left his mouth, the room erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Ethan stood firm, his resolve unshaken. The truth was out, and there was no going back now. He had exposed the one person who had been orchestrating everything, the one who had tried to ruin his life. And now, they would be held accountable. As the reporters scrambled to get more details, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he set out to do. The truth was out there, and nothing could take that away from him. But as the press conference ended and the flood of questions began, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The person behind this was powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. But Ethan was ready. He had been fighting for his life, for his future, and for justice. And no matter how dangerous things got, he wasn't going to stop until the mastermind behind it all had been brought to justice. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun.